Hi. Mantis is a hybrid synth. It's got digital oscillators, control and effects, and dual analog filters. It's a relatively minimalist synth. It takes hands-on controls and simplicity to an extreme, with no screen or menus and very few shift functions. However, it has a few tricks up its sleeve, with interesting oscillator shaping, filter routings in series and parallel, including stereo filtering, and up to 4-note polyphony, depending on how you define that term. It only has 2 filters, but each note gets an entire copy of the 4 oscillators in the oscillator section, a VCA envelope, and depending on polyphony, also a filter. In this video, I'll take an in-depth look at what it can do, play you quite a few of its presets in the end, and I'll also upload multi-samples of many of its sounds to my Patreon, so you can try it at home. Before I start, a quick disclosure: PWM sent me Mantis and its sibling Malevolent. Other than that, no money changed hands, they have no say over the content of this video, and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, let's start with an overview. Mantis is a collaboration between Paul Whittington, hence PWM, and the late synth great Chris Huggett, both with quite a bit of experience making analog, digital, and hybrid synths. With a few exceptions, it's very much knob per function, so you can figure out most of what it does just by looking at the panel. Left to right, you can store up to 200 presets on board in 2 banks of 100 presets. It's got 4 oscillators, 2 main oscillators. Oscillator 2 has 2 oscillators inside it and a sub-oscillator. The main oscillators have 6 core modes and wave shaping for each. There's a noise generator and ring mod, all of which can be fed into 2 analog filters that can be routed in various configurations with drive. These are either in series or parallel, and when in parallel, they can also be spread out in the stereo field. And then that audio gets fed into 2 effects, a digital chorus and digital reverb. On the modulation side, it has 2 LFOs, which can also be put in one-shot mode, and then 2 envelopes, which can be put in repeat or LFO mode. And there's reasons for doing each of those, which we'll discuss later. These envelopes and LFOs, along with other control sources like the joystick and aftertouch, can be pointed to one of 6 destinations, each of which has its own mod depth knob, bipolar mod depth knob, using a simple routing matrix. Mantis doesn't have a sequencer, but it does have an arpeggiator with an interesting mode that lets you hold an arp and play on top of it in the polyphonic modes. Speaking of polyphony, Mantis has both a duophonic mode and a quad mode. That's not quadraphonic in terms of speakers around the room, but rather 4 notes at a time. In these modes, Mantis still needs to work within the constraint that it only has 2 physical filters, but unlike some paraphonic synths that create 1, 2, or 3 notes from individual oscillators, in Mantis, each note actually gets a full copy of the entire oscillator structure of the synth, along with a dedicated VCA, a digital VCA for articulation, and in duophonic mode, also individual articulation for each of the 2 filters. So in that respect, it's more polyphonic than paraphonic. I'll discuss this in depth later in the video. Continuing with the overview, the overall build of Mantis feels very solid. The cheeks are attached with a magnet, so don't try lifting it from just one side. This does let you disconnect the cheeks and say connect new ones if you don't like the green ones. If I had to find one flaw in the build, it would be that the knobs are a little bit wobbly, which takes getting used to as you grab and turn them. And there's also a bit of latency in reading their values, which you might notice if you make fast sweeps back and forth, or when making changes to the step knobs. On the flip side, many of the parameters have bipolar control, in which case there's a nice detent in the middle that you can easily find, which is a good thing you don't see on all synths. The keybed is synth action. Feels pretty good in my opinion. It's full size and has mono aftertouch, which I think has very good sensitivity. It's also velocity sensitive. Works pretty well. You've got a joystick that bounces back, both for pitch bend, vibrato, and for holding the keys or locking the arpeggiator. You can also press it down, and then hold becomes a momentary hold. By the way, while Mantis may look like Malevolent, PWM's first synth, Malevolent is actually pretty small with its mini keys. Here's a size comparison if you're interested. And sound-wise, they don't sound the same. While Mantis can sound crunchy, that's pretty much where Malevolent picks up and takes things to a whole new level of aggression. So these are two very different synths, different oscillators, different filters, no presets or effects on Malevolent. So don't let looks fool you. This is not a mini version of Mantis, it's a totally different and more aggressive monosynth. In terms of connectivity, you've got 1/4-inch stereo outputs unbalanced and a headphone output, then both sustain and expression pedal jacks, MIDI in, out, and through, USB both for MIDI and for power, though not for audio transfer, and Mantis comes with a 9-volt wall wart power supply. The knobs on Mantis send out MIDI CCs, by the way, so you can use this with a computer or sequencer to record automation, or just as a generic MIDI controller when you want to use a software synth. Okay, let's dive in and take a look at what makes Mantis special. I'll start with an init preset and the oscillators. I'll start with Oscillator 1 because Oscillator 2 has a few more features, but in terms of shapes, they're identical. You've got a selection of 6 shapes with wave shaping, a sine with bipolar shape controls, then a core triangle waveform with wave shaping that looks like a wave folder, a sawtooth that morphs into a sawtooth an octave above, square that morphs into a pulse, and of course all of these can be modulated using shape mod. So that's the square or pulse, the saw, triangle, and sine. So really nice sounding oscillators, I think. And where things start to get a bit more interesting is the organ and wavetable options. Let's start with the organ-like oscillator. Now, when I first played this, I thought there was something wrong because as I played higher, it sounded very similar. But if you listen closely, it's kind of like a shepherd's tone effect, and it's less noticeable as you play higher, but sounds pretty similar in the lower octaves. So, it's a cool effect, and when you apply shape, additional harmonics are added to make a bigger difference between the octaves. And of course this works nicely in the duo or quad modes. And then the last shape option is the wavetable oscillator. This has just one wavetable with 7 shapes you can morph through using the shape knob. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And this can be modulated, of course, as well. So really nice metallic wavetable style sounds, but only one wavetable option and 7 waveforms. Currently, you can't import your own or add additional wavetable slots. So those are the shapes of Oscillator 1 and Oscillator 2. There's shape mod, as we saw earlier, and pitch mod, connected to, by default, LFO 1. And you've also got octave control, down and up. So that's Oscillator 1. Oscillator 2, like I mentioned, has the same shapes, but it has a couple of tricks up its sleeve. I'll bring just it up. It's got semitone tuning and fine tuning, and this obviously sounds better when paired with Oscillator 1. And then if we listen just to Oscillator 2, it's got a density parameter. So density will bring in another copy of the oscillator, mix it in, and then density rate acts like an LFO, modulating the tuning of the second copy against the first. So this is a pretty massive sound. Just for Oscillator 2, with its 2 oscillators, we can always bring in Oscillator 1. So now we've got 3 oscillators, and this is before we brought in the sub-oscillator for 4 oscillators in total. So that's the sub-oscillator, which is a sine wave as far as I could tell. And then there's an oscillator drift function, which is super subtle. It's kind of like a sample and hold slew LFO applied to detune, because you can detune without it. So that's with, without, pretty subtle. All this is just one voice or a set of oscillators. In quad mode, you can play 4 of these notes. There's no unison mode, unfortunately. It would be nice if they added that. Let's move on down the signal chain and talk about the mixer. This is quite different from anything you may be used to seeing on other synths. You can't actually control the level of the different oscillators or noise generator or ring mod individually, like you can the sub-oscillator. Rather, the signal sort of flows between oscillator 1 and 2. So this is oscillator 1, 2, and the mix of the two. Then that gets mixed in with noise. Then the result of that can be mixed in with a ring mod of oscillators 1 and 2. So if you want less ring mod, you can dial things back or crank it up all the way if you want. So it's a kind of unconventional way to cram 4 level knobs into 3. I find it a bit unintuitive, and it also means you can't turn down the level of the oscillators individually or the noise generator or ring mod individually to 0. You sort of have to constantly balance things between the 3 knobs. There is one feature that helps a little bit with level control. So if you feel like you're coming in too hot into the filter and distorting where you don't want to, then holding Shift and turning this knob turns down both oscillators 1 and 2. Speaking of interesting shift functions, this is the noise generator. If you hold Shift and turn this knob, it will gradually reduce the density of the noise, which is an interesting sound design option. So that's the mixer section. Let's skip over the LFOs for a bit and talk about the 2 filters. Mantis has 2 multi-mode 12 dB per octave filters, and they can be configured in one of 8 routings, some of which are in series and some of which are in parallel. In the first 3 options, they're in parallel. So regular 12 dB per octave filter with nice resonance that can get aggressive. You can hear that bit of distortion even though drive is all the way down. If you don't want that, remember Shift and level here can increase or reduce levels a bit, and then you get 0 distortion. Of course, if you want more, then with drive, you're welcome to it. We'll get to that in a bit. Anyway, that's the low pass filter, then band pass, without resonance, and with, then a high pass filter, 12 dB per octave, So I hear you ask, what's the point of having 2 filters and setting them to the same thing in parallel? Well, the answer is 3 things. First, you've got a width control. So let's go back to the low pass filter, turn width all the way down. So this may seem like a standard low pass filter, but if we increase width, you can see we've actually got 2 peaks in there to create formant-like sounds, or anything else you can do with 2 peaks. And that applies to band pass and the high pass. Then the second benefit of 2 copies of the filters is the voice spread feature. This lets you spread the panning of both filters, which is a really cool effect. I think we've got two filters at different frequencies. Spread them out a bit more across the spectrum. To an extreme. And this works in bandpass and high-pass modes. So nice stereo effect, I think. And then the third reason to have two copies of the same filter is the duophonic mode, where each note gets its own dedicated filter. This works nicely with voice spread as well. So when you do this, one is panned hard left and the other hard right. And the articulation is per filter as well. Let's maybe give it a long decay. So when we play two notes, they each get their individual filter articulation. So for two notes, Mantis is fully polyphonic in one of these three filter modes. When you're in duo mode, you can only toggle between these three. So those are the first three filter modes. Let's get out of duophonic mode and take a look at the next three. In the next three modes, the filters are still identical, but now routed in series, one into the other, which gives you a 24 dB per octave slope. It's louder. And the resonance is different. So this is maximum resonance in 24 dB mode. And you can hear how different it is in 12 dB mode. And the pre-filter drive also has a different effect here. So maybe add a bit of an envelope. So, without drive, with drive, and then 12 dB without drive, with drive. So I think that drive on the 24 dB per octave modes is more aggressive. In a good way. You can still use the width parameter in these modes, but since it splits the filters apart, it has a different behavior. So this is width. The more the width, the harder it is to hear, because when they're in series, one filter in low-pass mode is basically filtering out the other. You can still get formant-like sounds, just don't keep the width too high, so that you can hear both peaks. Same goes for bandpass mode. Don't split them up too much. They'll just drown out each other. Again, in high pass like low pass, one just cancels out the other if width is too high. Just sounds like one, basically. Voice spread, by the way, doesn't do anything in these modes because the filters are fed into each other. So, no stereo effect in any of these three modes. Then finally, for the last two modes, the filters are in low pass and high pass configurations in series and in parallel. Let's turn off modulation for a bit, maybe bring up noise. So wideband is basically a bandpass filter where you can spread its width without or with resonance. Pretty cool. Since this is routed in series, voice spread doesn't do anything here, but with wide notch, let's turn down width. We've got a notch where we can control its width with resonance. And stereo does work here. a stereo notch filter isn't something you see every day. And this can be modulated, of course, both width and the cutoff. A few more things about the filters. I'm going to reduce the noise density all the way down. That's the only way to turn the level of all the oscillators down. And you can see the filters self-oscillate across some of the range for some of the models. So let's turn on key tracking. Key tracking isn't perfect. And like I said, there's no self-oscillation below a certain frequency. Maybe if I increase drive, nope. So it depends on which mode you're in, but you can ping the filters. And for that, let's turn resonance down a bit and let's increase the density just a smidge to create little pings. And you can hear if we bring density up, so we go into low pass modes, you can hear the filter being pinged with the little grains of noise. And as I was fooling around with this earlier, I saved a preset with a few explorations of filter pinging. If we hold this and increase noise density, you can see the kind of rabbit holes you can get into with this synth. All right, let's start with an init preset and move on down the signal chain to the effects. You've got a chorus, stereo with 4 modes, modulation speeds. It's okay, but frankly, I think we can make fatter sounds just with the oscillators. And then we've got a reverb. It sounds pretty metallic. And you can filter the lows or the highs or both and increase the time. It's kind of a mix between a chamber and a spring, I think. And it has a nice pitch shifting going on. It can distort, by the way, if you feed it too much. Drive is all the way down, by the way. So maybe reduce levels a bit. It's got a character, which I think is pretty nice, but it's not your typical reverb. This reverb, by the way, unfortunately isn't in stereo. So if you feed it a stereo signal, it'll gradually get narrower in the stereo field and totally mono if you go all the way wet. So if you want to maintain the stereo field, keep it sort of somewhere in the middle. Okay, so that's the signal chain. Let's talk about modulation. Modulation in Mantis flows through mod routes. You've got 6 destinations with the depth for these destinations controlled by these 6 knobs. And then 2 groups of 5 mod sources that are multiplied by each other and control each other. Or you can use just one group by setting the other to full on. So if I wanted to use just a source here, this will be in full on. And if I wanted to use one of these 5 sources, I'd put this in full on. So for example, if I wanted to change oscillator pitch, I'd need to turn up the mod depth of oscillator pitch mod, and then choose a source, which can be, say, Aftertouch. This is bipolar. And then similarly, I could choose a source from the left group, from the control group. And as long as the right group is in full on, only the left source from the control group, the left mod source, will control the destination. In this case, either a sample hold or a, say, square LFO pointed to pitch. And then when both aren't in full on mode, then one controls the other. So Aftertouch now, along with LFO1, both are controlling oscillator pitch, subject to the mod depth. This also makes it pretty easy to figure out what's going on, say, in the factory presets. If we load up one, you can see exactly what's controlling each of the 6 destinations. By the way, in this patch, joystick X is controlling oscillator 1 shape, but by default it also bends pitch. I can disable the pitch bend and just leave this as a mod source in the matrix, in which case shape would change. Let's maybe go to low pass on this, but not pitch. So now that we know how the matrix works, let's take a look at the different mod sources. I'll go back to an init preset. Let's maybe take a sine wave. So we've got 2 LFOs, they're identical. By default, LFO 2 is controlling oscillator 1 shape. So let's increase shape mod, and then maybe turn down the rate a bit. So you've got the usual suspect shapes: sine, triangle, ramping up and down, square, and random. You can have the LFOs fade in or fade out, be in sync with the tempo or not, and with shift and sync we can turn the LFOs to one-shot mode, in which case they turn into an envelope based on whatever the shape is. So you've got a bunch of different shapes compared to the regular envelopes, and fade in and fade out impact these. So this may seem like a simple downward ramp, but by changing the fade in and fade out, we can alter its curve. Same goes for the other shapes. And then if you turn the LFO to sample and hold, you basically get a per note randomizer. Let's maybe turn this to filter cutoff and choose LFO 2 as the source. Let's not use fade in and out. And now we get a per key press randomization of the filter cutoff using the random LFO in one-shot mode. Anyway, so those are the LFOs. And then you've got 2 envelopes, one connected by default to amplitude and another assignable to anything you want in the matrix. So let's go back and assign envelope 2 to filter cutoff. Envelopes have the usual ADSR controls, and they can get nice and snappy. There's a repeat function that cycles between the attack and decay, turning them into an LFO basically. And then there's velocity sensitivity, bipolar, which I think is very useful and handy. Certainly for the filter envelope, I don't know why they made it bipolar for the amp envelope, but it's nice to have a link between velocity and amplitude. And then sustain fall is a nice one. It turns the sustain into a decay envelope as well. So notes will gradually die down. Okay, let's move on and talk about polyphony or voicing. In fully polyphonic synths, we wouldn't be having this discussion. If the spec says 4 or 5 or 12 voices, you'll typically get 4, 5, or 12 copies of the entire oscillator section, all the filters, modulation, and so on, except maybe the effects. If those synths are analog, they'll have 4, 5, or 12 physical copies of the circuits of the oscillator section and the filter section. Mantis is a bit different. Its CPU has enough power to generate 4 copies of the entire digital oscillator section, but those still need to pass through only 2 physical filter circuits. By default, if you press init, then you only get 1 note at a time, regardless of how many keys you press. I already mentioned this earlier. In duophonic mode, you're limited to just 3 filter arrangements, but each of the 2 notes you press, as long as you press 2 notes, and not 3, gets full filter articulation, all 4 oscillators. We discussed this. So let's talk about quadphonic mode. In quadphonic mode, you get all 8 filter arrangements, but there's only 1 copy of them. So you can play 4 notes, but the filter on top of those notes is just one filter. So for example, let's say that I was to assign LFO 2 to the filter cutoff. If I were to play 2 notes, or 3 or 4, they share the same filter articulation. The one exception, you can turn on quad and duophonic. You'll be limited to one of these filter modes. But in this case, if I turn on LFO 2 retrig, you can see the LFOs are bouncing against each other. So you're still playing 4 notes, but Mantis is trying to make sense of it all and pair 2 per filter. But if we ignore the filter, let's just start with another init preset, go into quad and say turn the oscillator into sine waves and bring in a long VCA attack and a long release. You can see that as we play 4 notes, each gets its own VCA envelope. Same goes, by the way, if we were modulating shape. You've actually got 4 copies of the LFOs. Overall, I found the quad modes to work fairly well, but it's a relatively new firmware update feature, so there are some quirks here and there in terms of the choice of notes to shut down when voice stealing is necessary. Hopefully these will be fixed in firmware updates, but beside that and the dual filters, Mantis can feel very much like a polysynth with up to 4 oscillators per voice, which is quite a feat even though it has only 4 voices in total. Let's move on and talk about the arpeggiator. It's a basic arpeggiator. You've got sync, swing, octaves, up to 6, and the usual suspect playback modes. I wish there was gate control here as well. And in what is a fairly unique feature, I think, in duo or quad modes, you can hold an arp and then play on top of it, even chords. And then if you want to change the chord, just hold it down again, change the chord, and then play on top of that. Change again, and continue playing on top of that. Which is pretty cool. One thing I'd like to see them add is different levels for the arp part and the chord or note part. Before we head out to the pros and cons, a few miscellaneous items. Mantis has a randomize function, which will randomize all its parameters. You never know what you're going to get. So it can be this, or this, or nothing. But occasionally, you might get something that will be an interesting starting point for sound design exploration. Set params is a panel mode. You've got legato and retrig options, which we talked about earlier. There's also a 10-level undo. When you hold shift, you use these buttons to undo. It doesn't undo every key press or knob movement, but you can use it to go back in time. And then there's glide or portamento with a legato option. And I think that pretty much covers everything. Let's talk about pros and cons for Mantis. If I had to say it in one sentence, Mantis's pros aren't that it ticks more feature boxes than competitors. For example, it doesn't have a sequencer, a comprehensive mod matrix. It only has one wavetable and you can't load user wavetables. It doesn't have many effects, but rather it takes a different route by doing the things that it does in a very unique way. I'll play you quite a few of its presets at the end of this video. Let us know in the comments section if you think it has its own character. In my opinion, it does, Probably on top of my list is its dual filters, which is fairly rare. Most synths are built around a single filter design. Mantis uses 2 filters, and it's not just about performance. They can be configured in multiple ways. The filters are analog and sound excellent. I think they can be driven pretty nicely. So they've got a broad range from smooth to aggressive, and besides the dual peak performance, they can be used for interesting stereo effects, and with drive a few screeching dual filter configurations. Then there are the oscillators with their shape mods, the sine wave with its subtle FM style harmonics, and the unique shepherd's tone organ sound with its craziness, and even the wavetable, though simple, has a lot of the greatest hits you can expect to find in wavetable synths. Then another pro for Mantis is its almost totally knob per function interface, including the very easy to understand and use routing matrix. There are some shift functions, but even if you forget them, over 90% of the things you can do here get a dedicated control on the panel. A display for preset names would have been nice, but other than that, it's not something that I missed. Then finally the reverb. Even though it's mono and it sounds metallic, I think it adds a lot of special character to the synth. With its subtle and sometimes not subtle detuning, it's just, for better or worse, not a typical reverb. So those are the pros. On the cons side, there are, of course, many things other synths can do that Mantis can't. I already mentioned some of those earlier, and while Mantis has, except for the filters, 4-voice polyphony, there are other synths with more voices. 4 isn't a lot if you're considering a polysynth. Same goes for modulation. With simplicity comes limitations. You only get 6 destinations in the routing matrix. Many of its competitors will have more sources and more destinations. I also found the quirky mixer layout unintuitive, especially since the filter can distort easily in polyphonic modes. If you want distortion, there's plenty of it, and that's a good thing. Just don't forget the shift level function to avoid unwanted distortion. Now, there is one thing to be said for this mixture design, and that's that it can be used as a one-knob performance tool to transition, say, from noise to the oscillators, or from oscillator to oscillator, or from the oscillators to ring mod. Kind of like how we use a filter cutoff knob to transition between timbres. So I still do miss individual oscillator level control, but there are some pros to this trade-off. I also really missed a delay effect here. If they figure out a way, maybe in firmware, to swap out the chorus for a delay, I think that would be great. The chorus is okay, I think, but you can get even better chorusing with all the oscillators around here, whereas a tempo synced delay, I think, would have been a great addition. I don't know if they can add that in a firmware update. While we're on the topic of firmware requests, it would be nice to have a pickup mode for the knobs so values don't jump when you load up a preset. Gate length control for the ARP would be great, and since there are 16 oscillators essentially here, a unison mode would be fun. So that's it for Mantis. Stay tuned for the presets. I'll upload multi-samples of several of its sounds to my Patreon, where you'll also find my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks. Hit like if this was useful. Ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.